I want to encourage everyone to refer to the program booklet for full bios of my esteemed panelists today, because I really want us to devote as much time as possible, the 40 minutes that we have, to our robust discussion. That said, I do want to briefly introduce all three of my panelists, starting with Isu Mayat. He is the Chief Diversity Officer, Equity and Inclusion Officer for the Orlando Magic. Isu focuses on integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion principles with the Magic's business goals, team values, and key performance indicators. He also leads the company's strategy to attract, engage, and retain diverse talent and make sure that talent is both heard and has a chance to advance. I love that part. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Raymone Jackson. Raymone serves as the Vice President, Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at T. Rowe Price. Raymone is responsible for T. Rowe Price's global diversity and inclusion strategy, overseeing current inclusion diversity programs and envisioning new strategies to help improve the attraction, development, and retention of diverse associates. He works across the firm externally, as well as with other key stakeholders, to really focus on actionable, sustainable programs. And last, and certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Crystal Hardie-Langston. Crystal is a principal at Vanguard and serves as the company's Chief Diversity Officer. Prior to her current role, Crystal was Chief Learning Officer and head of Vanguard's specialty rotational programs. Before her time in HR, she was the head of the institutional small sales market, where she had responsibility for Vanguard Retirement Plan Access, which is a comprehensive suite of 401k retirement plan services for small businesses. So we have a dynamite crew here, lots of great experience in the profession and the DE&I space. So what I'd like to do before we jump into the conversation is just kind of frame up how we got to where we are this afternoon. So over the course of this year, the Center for Financial Planning convened 3 forums of DE&I practitioners, and we had people from the financial planning profession as well as people from outside the profession, such as Isu, and we came together to really talk about lessons, challenges within the DEI work, and we really strove to create a broad, brave, and confidential space. We had some pretty spirited discussions, as I'm sure the panelists can attest to, but we really, at the end of the day, wanted to hone in on best practices and some industry-wide standards that we could propose. The group came together without competition, but really to create a true community where we could share our best practices, get advice from colleagues, and discuss new ideas, emerging ideas, and share some resources. We really landed on 3 themes from these discussions. The first one was about leadership and the buy-in of executive leadership, not just a statement of support, but a real demonstration of support. Really talking about authentic leaderships who convey their relationships and their learnings around race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and other areas. And also acknowledging when they don't know information, when they know that there's some learning to be had. We also talked about allyship as a form of accountability in terms of leadership across the profession. And we honed in on where leaders can leverage their position of power, of privilege, to help others within the industry advance and grow. The second theme that we talked about was the business case for DE&I has become much more acute and clearer over the past 2 years, as was mentioned earlier today. The consumer demand for diversity in leaders and in companies being accountable for standing up and addressing social issues. We also talked about the increased focus of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and that the heightened focus that we're seeing across the profession in that discussion, importantly around investing. And lastly, talked about the building of diversity, equity, inclusion infrastructure. This included not just building a team of people, but making sure that that budget is commensurate, that the needs and the demands of those individuals in those roles are being had, that we have some data collection practice and philosophy. We talked a lot about, because of the theme of this event being metrics that matter, let's talk about numbers that are substantial and have impact. And what are we looking at from a qualitative standpoint, and what are we looking at from a quantitative standpoint? So as you can see, we had a very robust discussion just from that quick summary that I provided. But what I'd like to do now is just pivot to our panelists to ask them if they could share an example of internal allyship within your team or someone else's that feels like you hit the mark over this last year. And I think I will start with Raymone, and then we'll go to Crystal, and then Isu.
Wonderful. Well, thanks. Wonderful. Well, thanks, Dawn. It's great to be here. It's great to be a part of today's conversation. As you said, this was definitely a great convening of thought leaders in this space. And as we think about allyship, it meant something different over the last 2 years. And as I think back on our conversation, some of the things that we talked extensively about was how maybe some general best practices evolved over time, specifically around reciprocal mentoring. So this is something that we've talked about for years, wherein a potentially senior leader is being mentored by someone that might be their junior, but being deeply steeped in what does it mean to be a person of color, to be a woman within our workplace and within our industry. We talked about tightening that work over the last 12 to 18 months, and those mentors were asking. They were leaning in and saying, I really want to understand more deeply now, what does this mean so that I can be a better ally to different communities within the organization. So that was one of the things that we talked about quite deeply as a team. And the second thing that I think was really important was around this notion of restorative listening circles, which was allowing space, brave space for associates to share how they were experiencing trauma, difference, change, their emotions over the last 2 years, ranging from racial injustice to the pandemic, but allowing space for us to talk about that, but more importantly for would-be allies or actual allies to gain an appreciation. And it wasn't about gaining empathy, it was about gaining opportunity.
Yep. Thank you, Raymone. Crystal?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I love what Raymone shared. You know, as we sort of talked about allyship and how allyship translates to action, we've had the privilege of engaging in some conversations about how allies are ensuring that DEI is central to the work they do in the business and the expectations and accountability that they are driving among their leadership teams. So as a member of our HR executive team here at Vanguard, allyship in my case looks like my peers considering DEI as central to how they do their work and the establishment of key results that are influenced by DEI and the way they carry out their outcomes. And we're thinking about what that looks like in other parts of the business as well. So true integration in how people sort of show up every day to think about DEI as central to their strategies has been a key way that we've talked about allyship.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. And Isu, I am putting the weight on your shoulders to represent all other industries outside of financial planning
all
as relates
other industries.
So please share.
That's great. No pressure. That's great. And I thank you and the CFP for inviting me to participate. It has been an exciting journey with my fellow panelists and the conversations that we have had leading up to this. In our organization, and I will say that I do think that this is relevant across other industries as well, the DEI journey, as we frequently talk about the importance and the significance of leadership being involved in that process, I would take that one step further and say that the role that leadership has been assigned in our organization is allyship. And we define allyship as the willingness to leverage positional power and privilege on behalf of those with marginalized identities. We agreed to embark on this allyship journey together. It began with the 2-day, 4-hour allyship training. And then this group comes back together on a bi-monthly basis to talk about the strategies that we learned. And we learned we talked about in our strategy session that we had pages and pages of notes that not only included ways in which we could advance our own active allyship journey, but that most of these solutions were at no cost to the organization. Most of these solutions were things that you could start right away. Most of these solutions were initiatives that you could begin immediately with your teams. And so as I said, we agreed to embark on this journey together, to regroup on a bi-monthly basis and talk about where it's going right, where we need to improve, and to continue to challenge ourselves to work through the range of strategies that we learn to advance our active allyship.
Yep. So you bring up a really great point about there were things already in place that could just, perhaps be slightly redirected or have some additional resources added. How do you think companies should go about re-examining their internal policies and practices so they can examine them for bias and really address some of those gaps that exist?
Well, I think, look, intellectually, we've known the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion for quite some time. And then in May of 2020, it moved from here, kind of an intellectual thing, to something that was emotional, right? And it started to hit home for folks, maybe some folks that it hadn't hit home for previously, when it was purely just a kind of intellectual deal. But at this point, when it comes to how to operationalize where people are and want to be, we in our organization, first, like a lot of organizations, we assess the culture of our organization, or reassess the culture of our organization. But part of this reassessment that I think has happened this time, and Raymone alluded to it, is it included these active listening sessions that I enjoy the different names that different organizations call them. Some call them unity circles, and another calls them difficult conversations. But I think we are listening in a way that we weren't listening before. One of the phrases that came out of some of our sessions is ATP, ask the people. If you're unsure what to say, ask the people. If you're unsure what the needs are, ask the people themselves. And so I'm happy that has become part of standard operating procedures for a lot of organizations, but also for us, in addition to these kind of listening sessions, we've been focused on what are we actually going to do about it, and how do we move from being transactional and activity-based to being more institutional and systemic and bringing forth the change that we need, being committed to that. And that, I think, ties into our theme for this conversation, which is to get into the infrastructure that is needed to make sure that DEI is an integral business process that every vertical in the organization leverages to achieve its goals.
Thank you, Isu.
Isu,
go ahead, Crystal, please.
Yes, I was so enthusiastic about Isu's point about sort of listening to the people in the organization. And so we're talking a lot about whether or not we feel like we have a contemporary pulse on all different, populations and communities in our organization around the world, so that they have input in how we think about the experience of the policies and the procedures. One of the other things that we've started to do more is to ensure that there's a risk conversation associated with the business case for this. Like, we very much see that this is imperative, and if we don't focus on it, we're actually creating risk to our mission on behalf of the client outcomes that we're looking to drive. So how we help people understand that as part of the language, as part of the urgency, helps us with the accountability that people need to take on to understand the process. And so changing the process doesn't become sort of a side hustle for someone. Like, no, this is your job. This is a part of your expected outcomes and results to really influence this change.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, to look at it as a risk factor and how you're mitigating risk. And Raymone, if I could ask you to kind of take that point along with the question that came in about, well, why now? Why is the financial services profession and firms within our profession now really kind of elevating the focus in this area?
It's a great question. And Dawn, if I can add one thing to the last question, I think around policies, because it's so important, is the first thing is to assume that there's bias everywhere. Like when you approach this work that way, you approach it more honestly. So at T. Rowe Price, we actually brought in a consultancy this year to do an audit of our policies and our systems. And we got a roadmap of probably more areas than I was prepared to see around areas that needed some focus, but we were able to roadmap those over time. What it did additionally was it allowed us to look at some of our closely held systems to say, are these things requirements or are they traditions and preferences? Mm-hmm. And what you will find is when you ask that question, many of the things that you do are actually a preference and not a requirement, which will also allow us to exclude people unconsciously. So I think that's just one step, just to close that last part of the conversation. And as we talk about kind of why it seems to be a larger priority now, I think it's always been a priority. Thankfully, it's being driven by clients now. We've got clients that are saying we will only do business with firms and individuals that share our sense of values. So they're asking about representation. They're asking about your policies and your procedures. They're asking, what does your board look like? So as we've seen boards diversify, we've seen senior leaders diversify, we're starting to see that additional attention placed around this. You think about DE&I and you think about ESG together. Those are two very powerful convergences that are connected, that's forcing leaders to think very differently. I talked to a client last week, and this client said to me and a few leaders that as they're looking at their financial services partners, they look at a lack of progress in DE&I with the same risk that they do you having financial solvency. That's a big shift in terms of clients saying, I will take my money away from this company because this is a business risk. So I think those are some very large shifts that are driving the way that we think about this work, and it's moving DE&I from an HR function to a true business function, which is where I think it belongs.
Yep. That's a great example. It's also a great transition to my next question. As we've discussed, our theme for this summit is metrics that matter. And we've talked to some degree about collection and sharing of data internally and externally and how critical that is to advance the work in this space. Crystal, can you share some examples within your organization at Vanguard where you've done that or things that you're looking to do in the future?
Absolutely. So at a high level, we want to focus on representation and inclusion. And we're clear relative to outcomes and things that we measure that both are important. And then we have sort of key results that attach to those that are important to us and that are connected to the strategic levers that we think will best help us achieve those things. So on the attraction front, for example, we have slate diversity measures that we think are important on behalf of the candidates that are sort of vetted for opportunities in our organization. On the retention front, we are looking not only at rates of retention among underrepresented groups, but we're looking at where there are deltas in attrition and trying to understand, the sources of those on behalf of different underrepresented communities. We are focused on advancement. And so we're paying attention to things like what is that representation mix of underrepresented groups that are getting access to some of our most critical development opportunities as an organization. And then on the inclusion front, so many of our organizations are doing these annual engagement surveys. And we ensure that we've got DEI related questions included in those and that we are parsing out that data with a cross-sectional view on underrepresented groups, gender and ethnicity, in terms of where we sort of have the most prevalent amounts of data so that we can see underneath the numbers and detect trends over time and use those things to help hone our strategy.
That's a great example. Raymone, can you share some things that T. Rowe Price is looking at or has already implemented?
Yes, so I echo what Crystal shared. I mean, it's one of the great things about our industry is that we love numbers, we love data from an investment perspective. So we're taking that mindset over to the people side of the house as well. So we look at the same things that Crystal shared. What I would add in addition to that is inclusion indexes, which takes kind of the engagement survey piece a little bit further and says, how do different groups experience a sense of belonging within the organization? And that usually helps us be able to determine where are there gaps? Are those gaps around career development? Are those gaps around compensation? Are those gaps around a sense of connection to the organization? So those things help us. And what I think is really important is that we go a bit deeper. So in addition to looking at it at the top of the house, we look at it by business unit so that we can look at contributions and then hold leaders accountable to those actions. And we're looking to go even deeper now into different business units to see if we're seeing differences by leader so that we can now coach individuals in different ways. For me, I think it's important that we inspect what we expect of the organization. One of the things at T. Rowe Price that we tested this year was pushing out a DE&I performance objective. So we all have performance goals for the year. We said it is important that we all have a role to play in this culture. So we pushed out from the CEO a performance goal around DE&I. And now leaders are having those conversations around how did you contribute? Where did you show up? Where did you miss the mark? And it does have an impact on their final performance rating. So again, trying to build more systems in so that we can now hold people accountable in some very direct ways.
Thank you, Raymone. And Isu, I know from, the past 22 months, 21 months now, particularly in sports, particularly the NBA, there has been a very heightened emphasis on some of these things and making sure that the mantra, what gets measured gets done. Can you share some things that the Magic has done, or even more broadly, the NBA?
Sure, and very similar to some of the things that have already been talked about and discussed. But what I would say most recently, what we have done is tied this performance goal, this global DEI performance goal, so similar to Raymone, that's part of every review in the organization, tied that to the bonus formula for leadership in our organization. And what that actually looks like, there's three components to it, right? So number one, as an organization, we are benchmarking. We use the Diversity Inc. Top 10 Hall of Fame as our index for benchmarking representation in our organization. So that's a global goal, but that's also cascaded down to every department. And so that's one component of how they will be measured. The other component is supplier diversity and the percentage of spend that every department has, and what percentage of that spend is going to women and minority-owned businesses. So we're measuring that again at a macro level and at a micro level. And then last but not least, we are measuring the percentage of the people on your team that are engaged in one or more of our employee engagement programs. So employee resource groups, or throughout the NBA, we have a quality and social justice task force. Historically, what we know is there's at times, a conflict between, employees that want to participate in a business resource group or an employee resource group, but their manager is saying, but what does that have to do with your job? And how are you able to take out an hour of your day to go be engaged in this kind of social function? Well, whether it's purely social or personal or professional, if it's adding to deepening the sense of belonging and inclusion, then it's adding to this intangible asset that we call discretionary effort, which we all would agree, whatever happens in our life, it also impacts how we show up to work every day. And so we're encouraging them to persuade their teams to participate as opposed to dissuading their teams to participate. And last but not least, we are using our DEI dashboard as a means of tracking the activity throughout the organization and reporting what's happening on all three of those fronts on a regular basis in senior leadership meetings, adding therefore another layer, another level, if you will, of I want to say accountability, but at the same time, this, we're in sports, right? So like you all, we're very, very competitive, and no one wants to see their name at the bottom of the list when it comes to that dashboard and participation in DEI. So that's kind of almost an intrinsic motivation to change behavior.
That's great. One of the other things, just kind of pivoting on to one of our other topics, and not just in the 3 DEI forums, but we talked a lot in previous years about sourcing talent, right? And not just sourcing, but retention and promotion. Those two areas are probably less discussed, but certainly equally, if not more important. You can, kind of onboard people, but what are we doing to retain, to grow, to develop? Can you share an example of where you've identified and or driven an initiative to address this issue? And I'll start with Crystal on that one.
Absolutely. Dawn, I think what you said is so critical in terms of, beyond the sourcing, what does the onboarding look like? Who has accountability for that experience? Because that foundation, particularly for underrepresented talent, of the onboarding experience sets the stage, for the experience going forward, particularly in environments where this talent is underrepresented. So those early feelings of belonging are so critical. And there's been really rich research done over the years that shares that underrepresented talent, you really have like a 2 to 3 year period upon them joining the organization to really entrench engagement. After, say, a 3-year period, it falls off the cliff. If these are folks that don't feel like they're really belonging or valued on behalf of their experience. One of the things that we've done sort of goes back to something I mentioned earlier, where we want to ensure that we've actually got mechanisms in place that are providing forums where people can feel psychologically safe to be candid about their experiences, because every tool doesn't always create that. And we have been sort of providing resources to our different divisions, to different levels of group, to give them, the ability to do just that. We're having a lot of conversations about how frequently that tool is available, right? Because if you're only doing something on a census basis once or twice a year, you're not getting a contemporary pulse on what people are experiencing day in and day out, and you'll be that much slower to be responsive to it. So we're doing some things to think about that. We also, we have this conversation about, who has true accountability for something like retention. And,
right.
We talk about the fact that, hey, it's really leaders who have the day in and day out accountability of the retention of their crew, or we call our employees crew, by the way. But as we think about our role as a HR or a DEI function, it's about how we enable the leaders to do that. And so we've been working on the development of some toolkits, that help our leaders to engage their crew and their talent, particularly in these times where we're all in a war, for retention of talent and attracting new talent.
That's right.
And they are the types of tools that lead people to questions beyond you're good, right? Let's ask some deeper questions about whether people feel like they have access to what they need in the environment. What kinds of things might make them leave tomorrow if they picked up the phone and answered that call? And then there's the accountability of having leaders address those things with personal developments that are specific to those folks, real conversations about career pathing and what folks have access to, or real direct feedback about what things might be holding them back. We also know that underrepresented talent is less often getting access to candid, timely feedback. So ensuring that we're kind of breaking those habits are important parts of how we're thinking about that retention work stream in our organization.
That's great. Raymone, what's happening over there at T-Row? T-Row Price.
It's like mic drop from what Crystal shares, like a mic drop moment. All of that stuff is the important things, and we're doing similar things as well. One of the pieces that I think is probably helpful, and it kind of goes a little bit deeper into what Crystal was sharing. Retention is the name of the game in terms of keeping talent, and the things that we're focused on right now are focused on kind of that career development, that sense of connection, especially in a remote environment and a hybrid environment where you may not see people as often as you saw them 18 months ago. So finding ways to, through one-on-ones and virtual coffee chats, to build a sense of connection and finding kind of that best friend at work, so to speak, from the Gallup survey. But one of the things I think is important is around this notion of leaders understanding what their associates need and where the concerns are. And you might have heard of something called a stay conversation in the past, where a leader is talking to an associate to try to, what would it take to make them stay? I think there are some gaps in that framework. So I've kind of retooled it as a commitment conversation, which is really having a very similar discussion around kind of what motivates you, what are your career aspirations, where are your concerns, where can I be a better leader for you? What can we do in the next 12 to 18 months that will strengthen your career and your connection? And for me, it really is that leader now making a commitment to the associate, as opposed to the associate kind of making a commitment to stay. It's not about the associate. It's about what I do as a leader that will make this person want to stay in this organization and stay on my team. So kind of flipping kind of the objective there a little bit. And this will be our second year engaging in those conversations. And my hope is that through those processes, it becomes a standard once-a-month check-in. It shouldn't be a deliberate once-a-year thing. It really should just be an ongoing conversation that leaders are having consistently with their reports.
That's a great example. I have one more question from our prep session, and then we have a few more minutes to take some of the questions that have been coming in from attendees. So this is the big one for all three of you. What would you want to see out of the industry in the next 1 to 2 years? And this obviously is from a DE&I perspective. Anyone who wants to take it, feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in, and because I wanted to just chime in on the last part of the conversation. I think that question also, Dawn, ties back to very intimately to the business case, right? The reality is there's a global talent shortage. And with that in the backdrop, it then means that diverse talent can and should be and will be part of the solution moving forward. Hence the connection between the last part of the conversation and what you just asked. In addition to that, however, is, 75% of our organization is Gen Y and Gen Z. That's a trend that everyone is going to experience if they haven't already. And with this transformation happening, these generations have a different value proposition for at work. DEI is important to them in a way that maybe it wasn't to generations prior to them. When we talk about belonging, this would be my hope, right? Is that because I agree with Raymone that retention is key. We need to unpack belonging. Well, sometimes we just kind of put it all together and we say diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and we finish the rest of our sentence, but we really don't unpack that belonging piece. Look, there's two levels of belonging. There's social belonging, and then there's professional belonging, right? And so our allies oftentimes, because they're coming from a good place, tend to focus on the social belonging. Hey, I really, really like Dawn, and when she comes in the room, high five, Dawn. I see you, girl, doing your thing. Keep it up, right? And that's great. That's amazing, right? And I'm sure it feels really good, right? On the surface, it feels really good, right? But in reality, what we are looking for is more of this intellectual belonging, this professional belonging. Not just I like Dawn, but I value the way Dawn approaches this work. She's a real thought leader in this space, and we can't continue with this particular project without her expertise in the room. That lands very, very differently than this pure social construct around belonging, right? So my hope is that we start to understand these things more deeply and more intimately. And last but not least, my hope is that we will all, if we haven't already, begin to really believe in the reality that Zig Ziglar said, whatever we're doing today either prepares us to be the leaders of yesterday or the leaders of tomorrow. And so to be the leaders of tomorrow, we have to understand that in the 21st century, the growth and vitality of our business is predicated on our ability to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in a very meaningful way, in an institutionalized way, and in a systemic way.
That's great. Crystal, looks like you're ready to answer that deep question. What would you like to see out of the industry in the next 1 to 2 years?
It very much builds on Isu's points about our opportunity to, as an industry, recognize the link between what we're trying to do, with DEI internal to our organizations and what that means relative to how we show up as product and service providers. And, just as Isu mentioned, we've got this forthcoming generational change, which includes a much more diverse population, of talent and future clients. And increasingly, you're seeing this intersection of prospective talent say, I don't just want to work for an employer that has representation goals internally. I also want to work for an organization that sees my community and that sees me and is having an influence on the way that my community builds financial legacy, in our case, as a financial service industry. So I think the sort of recognition that we as an industry have of that and the recognition that we demonstrate relative to the way that we tell stories. We talk about our offer, design products and services for the access of underrepresented communities is such a big frontier, an important step for us.
Thank you, Crystal. Raymone, your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'd offer two things. One is probably not 2 years, but I think it should be on the table. I love this industry. It's been my entire career in it. I think that we have a responsibility to close the hurdles, the gaps around access to financial plans. I think, I heard the previous panels talking about the generational wealth gaps and things like that. It's only continuing to widen. We are collectively in a space where we can figure out how to solution that, whether it's through financial empowerment tools and workshops. We're doing it individually and in small pockets. But how do we kind of channel that into something that can actually lift these communities that have been systematically kind of cut out of these conversations? That's one thing. I think it's a big thing, but I think we can do it as an industry. And the second piece is around doing some very deep truth telling about where we are with our representation. None of us are likely where we want to be. And I think that us being more transparent with where we are opens the door for us to how do we collectively start to move the needle. We'll see our numbers. This is the representation goals. I want to do a 10% increase. What's the base? Our clients are asking us kind of what's the actual numbers, and and we're sharing them where we can. And for me, my thing is I don't hold shame with where we are. We are where we are. I didn't create it, but I'm in it now, and I'm in a position to disrupt it. So I think collectively, if we find a way to be able to be a bit more transparent around where we are, we can now start to look at moving the needle forward in some really progressive ways, hopefully.
That's a great answer on that one. In our remaining couple of minutes here, I do want to try to get at least a couple of the questions from the attendees out to you all. One was about internships and what opportunities for someone who's interested in coming into the profession might want to enter the career. I will say the session right before this one was a really great one that talked about different career paths and how to pursue a career in various areas within financial planning. But can any of you quickly share any other tips of the tips or things that helped you get into the industry?
Dawn, I just wanted to take a moment to share a program that JP Morgan Chase has implemented. And it's called the Advisor Development Program. One component of this program is the fact that there's a HBCU iteration where they are going to license and create 185 new positions by teaching this business at the HBCU level, teach it through internships. They're hoping to then have that fill a broader program in the workforce that is a 24 to 36 month program where they continue to educate and train and coach individuals who want to be in the financial advisor space. 80% of the current cohort consists of women and people of color, and just about 80% of the initial cohort has already gone into the business. And so I think it's programs like that. First of all, they are holistic in their approach, and secondly, their outcomes align with what the needs of the business are, so that this internship program is a legitimate and formal pipeline development program, as opposed to just the right thing to do.
That's important, and thank you for sharing that. And we did have other firms such as JP Morgan who did contribute to our discussions over the year. I do think the smaller firms might also be able to take advantage of that as a resource. That was another question that came into the chat about smaller firms who may not be fully equipped to have all the resources and staffing in place that tapping into a program like that might help, at least on the pipeline, at least starting the pipeline. And then, of course, some of the development and retention items that we talked about. Well, we are running up to close here. I think we could go on for much longer, and I'll share that we often did in our DEI forums. But I do want to take this time to thank Raymone, Isu, and Crystal for joining me in this conversation. And I do look forward to continued collaboration and partnership with you all, not just in the 1 or 2 years as the question was raised, but way beyond that. And thank you all so much for your thought, your talent, and your expertise in this area. Now what I'd like to do, we are on to the final section of our day one of the Diversity Summit, and it brings me great pleasure to introduce Cristina Santos. She is the Senior Vice President, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Capital Group, and she will be providing closing remarks for us for today's summit. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dawn and Raymone, Asu, and Crystal for sharing your key takeaways and best practices from the Center Forum on Racial Diversity in Financial Planning. Good afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Cristina Santos, and I'm with the Capital Group, where I get to lead our efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we are a proud sponsor of this year's Diversity Summit, and so much of what's shared today really resonates with the work that we're doing at Capital Group as well, especially when it comes to the senior leadership engagement and what we just heard from the panel on the criticality of accountability metrics, setting clear objectives, and transparently communicating our progress. I think that's so critical. And what a great first day. I want to thank all of the speakers and panelists we heard from throughout the day. I especially appreciated the honest conversations and how so many opportunities were identified, but also sharing of possible solutions. You know, we heard a lot of experiences, knowledge, and insights that clearly demonstrate, I think, a very strong commitment across financial services as an industry and the financial planning profession, and a lot of different organizations when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So very special thank you as well to all of the sponsors for the summit. Founding sponsor, Northwestern Mutual, InvestNest, Charles Schwab, and then our premier sponsor, Merrill Lynch Wealth Management, as well as major sponsors, Capital Group, Ballantine Financial, and Vanguard. Benefactor sponsors are FARE, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley Wealth Management, champion sponsor, WealthSpire, supporting sponsors, Equitable, Facet Wealth, LPL Financial, and Wilmington Trust. Patron sponsors, Edward Jones and Fidelity, and contributor sponsor, FlexShares Northern Trust. We're really looking forward to having you join us tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern Time. And we will have Camilla Elliott and Brent Kessel will give an opening keynote presentation on the 2 American financial plans. We'll also hear from Marcus Mallinson from Merrill Lynch about his experience as a professional of color in the financial services industry. We'll have 2 sets of concurrent sessions tailored to different stakeholders. So whether you're a senior executive, DE&I practitioner, firm manager, financial planners, CFP board registered program faculty and students, there's something for you. And those concurrent sessions will offer an opportunity from where you sit within the industry to dive even deeper into the metrics that matter. Elisa Sangster at Forte Foundation, Ricky Taylor at the Association of African American Financial Advisors, and Whitney Tomey of the Raven Group will lead us through a workshop on how to practice racial and gender allyship even more so at your institution. And then finally, we are in for a real treat. MacArthur Fellow and best-selling author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi will talk about the true meaning of anti-racism and how it applies to the financial services industry. So thanks so much for being with us today. Really looking forward to another great day that starts tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. Have a wonderful night.